Now, at the edge of their property were some woods. And in the middle of those woods was an old house. It was fallen in, and you could just barely see the top of it over the trees.
So bring your courage, there's no rules.
Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back. Hope you're all doing well and having a great day. And we're about to get into a little down home ghost. Before we do though, couple of things. First, I'm sorry. I actually had it all nice and straight and pretty, and then I got caught out in the rain. And any of you girls, or guys for that matter, that have naturally curly hair, you know rain is your mortal enemy. So, yeah. Y'all get, frizzy fuzzy Mandy today. Sorry. Second, I got to kind of thinking about something because of a comment Summer of Corn's channel made on my last down home ghost video, talking about he had a ghost story of his own. So I get to thinking, why don't you guys tell me your ghost stories? Maybe sometimes with down home ghost. I mean, I know down home ghost originally started out, it was supposed to be all based on southern ghost stories. But down home doesn't just have to mean southern. It can be wherever you live. It can be your home, somewhere you've lived in the past. So maybe we could do something where either you guys tell me your stories and I tell them, or maybe even do something where maybe interview you guys about your ghost stories, do like a Discord type thing. Let me know what you guys think, and if it's something one of you would like to participate in, if you guys have a story, let me know, okay? Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, my website, here on YouTube, Twitch, somewhere. Just let me know, okay? Alright, guys. Let's get into a little something spooky. Today, I want to tell you guys the story of a young man named Edward. When Edward was a kid, his parents bought a little ranch-type house way out in the country in Tennessee. A lot of things take place in Tennessee, huh? Well, Edward had an older sister, and they were just thrilled to move into this house. They had a big yard to run in. They each had their own rooms. It was a dream come true for them and their parents. Now, at the edge of their property were some woods. And in the middle of those woods was an old house. It was fallen in, and you could just barely see the top of it over the trees. Well, the first thing Edward's mom did was warn him and his sister, you stay away from there. Don't go there. There's no telling what's in there. Snakes, coyotes, fox, and it could fall in on you. Well, kids being kids, that just made them even more curious about the old house in the middle of the woods. So one day, when they knew their mom was taking a nap, they decided they were going to find out exactly what that house looked like close up. Edward's older sister got their dad's machete out of the shed. They said their dad kept the machete around, for cutting back brush and for killing snakes. Go figure. But they took the machete and they used it to cut a path through the woods. It wasn't that far to the old house, but it was really overgrown. Once they got to the old house, they wanted to go in, but they could tell just from where they were standing. The doors were gone, the windows were gone. This place was a wreck. And they could look through and see most of the floors had fallen in long ago. And the second story was starting to fall. So they stood there debating on whether or not it was worth the risk. And then they heard giggling. Who would be at this old, abandoned, half-burnt, fallen down house? Well, suddenly, a little girl and a little boy came around the side of the house, and they seemed as shocked to see Edward and his sister as Edward and his sister were to see them. The little girl just kind of stared at Edward and his sister. His sister's name was Nancy. Nancy and Edward just stared back at them. But the little boy, he started to just slowly inch forward toward them. The little girl reached out and put her hand on his chest and shook her head at him. He looked at her. "Sissy, why? I want new people to play with." Nancy and Edward figured, well, they can't be that bad. I mean, they're just kids, like us. So Edward stepped forward and introduced himself. Nancy followed her little brother's lead and did the same. The little boy quickly introduced himself. His name was Will. However, the little girl stood stone silent and just stared at them. Well, Will and Edward started talking. Edward had a few little Hot Wheels cars in his pocket. He pulled out and showed Will, and they carried on a conversation while the two girls just stared at each other. Nancy finally got tired of the stare down and looked at the girl and said, "Look, I don't know why you don't want to talk to us or play with us, but if you want to, we just live through the woods here. You can come play." The girl eyed Nancy for a minute. She seemed very suspicious of them. But finally, she kind of shrugged. She said, "Okay." Well, Nancy started to lead all of them back through the woods, through the path they had cut, back to their yard. Along the way, the girl finally says, "By the way, my name's Jessica." Well, they go play, and although they had on strange clothes, Edward and Nancy decided they liked Will and Jessica. And it seemed like Will and Jessica liked them. Well, finally, it was about supper time. Edward told Nancy he wanted to invite Will and Jessica to eat. She said she didn't think their mom would have a problem with it, so Edward invited them. Jessica got that suspicious look again, and she told him, "No, we have to go home." She grabbed Will by the hand, and back through the woods toward the burnt house they went. Now, Nancy and Edward knew that there was 2 or 3 houses on the other side of the woods, so they just assumed, okay, they live in one of those, and they're just cutting through past the old house to go home. Well, at supper, Edward proceeds to excitedly tell his mom all about these new kids that came to play. Immediately, their mom said, "Where did you meet these kids?" They just showed up in the yard. Mom kind of gave them, you know the eye moms give when they know you're lying. She gave them that eye. She said, "Are you sure you weren't somewhere you weren't supposed to be?" "Oh, no, Mama, no. She didn't quite buy it, but she decided to let it ride. Well, over the next few weeks, Jessica and Will came to play with Edward and Nancy quite a bit. They found they really enjoyed each other's company. But what Edward found strange was they always had on the same clothes. He mentioned it to Nancy, and Nancy told him not to be rude. Maybe they just couldn't afford other clothes. And their clothes always looked clean, so obviously what few clothes they had, their mom kept washed. Now, Edward wasn't sure that was the case, but he didn't want to be rude, so he took Nancy's advice and just kind of kept his thoughts to himself. Well, they noticed after a couple of weeks that Will and Jessica kind of referred to things that didn't quite make sense. They talked about the wagon their dad, who they called Pa, had to use to get back and forth to work. Keep in mind, this was in the mid-80s, 1980s. Why would someone still be using a wagon? Well, Edward questioned Nancy over that, and she reminded him the area they lived in had a big community of Mennonites and Amish. So maybe that would explain their clothing and the wagon. So Edward bought that. He thought, hey, that's a good point. Well, Jessica made reference one day to the fact that their mother, who she called Ma, wouldn't really like them playing with them. And Edward and Nancy immediately wrote it off to perhaps it was because of the Mennonite or Amish culture. While they're normally not rude people, they don't associate a lot with what they called the English. So they just kind of thought maybe that was it. One day, Edward decided to ask Will, can you at least show us your house? Can we just, maybe peep at it through the woods? Will just kind of looked at him kind of funny and said, but you've been to my house. You know what my house looks like. Edward was confused. He had never seen their house. He had never been there. Why would Will say he had? And he was about to question him over that when Jessica suddenly grabbed Will by the arm and said, I hear Ma, we have to go. And they disappeared through the woods. Well, it wasn't long before school started. And the second day of school that year, they got on the bus, and one of the girls in the bus said, so, how do you like living by the haunted house? Edward looked at her strange. What are you talking about? And she proceeded to tell them that her dad's family used to own that home. The home set in the middle of the woods. And his cousins and their children were actually living in the home at the time it burned. Edward found that kind of strange. Well, why didn't you guys ever rebuild it? Why didn't your family rebuild or tear it down? And she told him that their family thought it would be like desecrating a grave. He said, you mean somebody died in the fire? She said they all did. The mom, the dad, and the two kids. Nancy overheard this conversation. She said, what were the kids' names? She said, I can't really remember the boy's name, but I know the girl's name was something like Jessica. It was Jessica. Our little brother's name was Will. Nancy and Edward immediately felt sick. Edward questioned Nancy, this can't be the same two kids, right? She's like, of course not. There's no such thing as ghost. It would have to be ghost if it was the same two kids. Oh, for days, they didn't see Jessica and Will again. And it just kept eating at Edward. He just had to know. So finally, he begged Nancy to go to the middle of the woods with him, to go back to the house and see if they could call them, find them, something. So they did. They walked to the corner of the old burned house, and Edward stood there. Will, Jessica, are you guys around? And out of the front door of the house popped Will and Jessica. Jessica looked stern. Shh, Ma'll hear you. Nancy looked at Edward. She looked at Jessica and Will, and she had no idea how to approach the question they had came to ask these two children. Luckily, she didn't have to, because Edward blurted it out. Are you two dead? Will's eyes got big. Jessica's mouth dropped. They looked like they were horrified at the mere suggestion. But then Jessica seemed to soften a bit. She said, how did you figure it out? Edward said, well, your clothes, they look a little different. You talk a little different. You just seem to pop up out of nowhere all the time. And a girl on a bus told us you guys died. Jessica ducked her head. She said it was a long time ago. She said the wood heater, something went wrong. We all woke up in the middle of the night. The whole house was on fire. The flames were too hot to get through. We couldn't get out. Nancy stood there for a minute in just utter shock. And then she reached out to touch Jessica. To her surprise, her hand didn't go through her. It wasn't anything like it is in the movies where you touch a ghost and you just go straight through them. Jessica felt as real as Nancy and Edward. So she tried to touch Will. Same results. She said, you two can't be ghosts. Jessica told her. Said, how would you know? Have you ever been one? About that time, there was a noise from inside the burned house. Jessica looked over her shoulder. She said, Ma told us we're not supposed to let anybody see us. That people will try to make us go away and split us up. We won't be a family anymore. You have to go. She'll be angry. Jessica and Will turned around to go back into the house. Edward tried to stop them, but wait, what if we tell her we won't? They disappeared on into the house anyway. And then Edward and Nancy heard a god-awful rumbling. The house in front of them started to shake. Terrified, they ran back through the woods and back home, and this time straight into the house and told their mother the truth. They told them they'd been playing with these kids for weeks. They told her exactly what they looked like. What they had told them. What they had been told on the bus. Their mom sat, just stared, listened silently. She kind of shook her head. She said, I don't want you going back near that house. I told you from the very beginning, stay away from that house. She seemed not necessarily angry, but just very upset and almost scared. Edward thought it was because, they were telling her they just seen a ghost. That wasn't all of it. After she'd taken a little while to calm down, she called the kids back into the living room. And she set them down and told them they had to have a talk. Kids, we bought this house to be close to your grandparents, right? Yes, Mama. I grew up in the house with your grandparents, right down the road. Yeah, Mama. She said, I've heard about those two kids since I was a kid. She said, and I saw them. One time, I was on my bike, riding up and down the road, and it started to rain really hard, so I was pedaling fast trying to get back home. They were standing on the road out in front of the old house. She said, at first I thought it was just the rain making me see things. She said, but as I got closer, I could absolutely see two kids dressed in some really strange clothes. She said, and I told my mom, your grandma. And she told me the story of the family who died there. She even showed me old newspaper clippings. Do you think Grandma still has them? That was the first question out of Nancy's mouth. So their mom called their grandma. She said she did indeed have them. They went down to her house, which is only like a quarter of a mile down the road. To Edward and Nancy's surprise, staring back at them from that piece of browned, aged newspaper was Jessica and Will. Edward said he didn't tell Nancy, but he continued to play with them until they were teenagers, until they actually moved from that house to another one. And that to this day, he still wonders if they're there, and if anybody goes to play with them. Sometimes, even death doesn't stop a mother's love for her children. Jessica and Will's mom just wanted to protect them and wanted to stay a family with her babies. And just like living mothers, maybe she was a little overprotective because Edward and Nancy were glad to be their friends and wouldn't have done anything to hurt them. So maybe we're not so different in death as we are in life. Just something to think about. Alright guys, I'm going to get out of here for now. Hope you guys have a great day, and next time you see an old house, before you decide to go exploring, just remember, you may be trespassing where somebody still lives. Bye guys.
Down the night, coming just like the sun.